just to begin with, a couple of kind of quite silly kind of quotes, but the point is just to show you how competitiveness in English football has always been a hot topic, basically. So here's the first quote from Victor Chandler, 2005. So, I'm disillusioned with football. You know before the start of the Premier League that there's only 3 teams out of 20 that can possibly win it. And there's no fun in that. Victor Chandler is one of the main bookmakers in the UK. So quite an interesting comment from him. So this is from Dave Whelan, who's a former owner of Wigan Athletic, who are one of the teams in the English top flight for some years. So he says that we know that the next year, one of the top 4 teams will win the league and the other 3 will be in the top 4 again. That's not competitive. David Moyes, who was manager of Everton at the time of this quote, who's now manager of West Ham. So he says it's been really hard for clubs outside the top 4 or 5 to win anything. And then to round off with a quote by Pep Guardiola, who's the manager of Man City currently. He says, it's not a sport if success is already guaranteed, which is quite ironic given that Manchester City have almost a kind of dominance over the Premier League over the last so many years. All right, so it's a topic of interest, and people will always discuss this, I think. So here's some more posts about this issue in the media. Here's a screenshot from a Twitter post about the lack of competitiveness in the Bundesliga. So I believe that Bayern Munich have won the past 10 Bundesligas and maybe on course to win the 11th, I think. So very, they're utterly dominating the German league. And here's an interesting article on The Athletic, a sports online newspaper. It's by Michael Cox. He's a really renowned author on football and football analytics, as it's sometimes called. So he talks about how you can make Europe's big leagues more competitive. And he makes the point that there's many leagues in Europe, including the German league and others, where the winners are always from a small pool of teams. And he's come up with a few suggestions for how to make the leagues more exciting. So again, it's an issue that continues to dominate the media. So what we try to do then is we try to, in some way, develop a statistical model to assess how competitive a league is. And the way we do that is to, as I said at the beginning, is to develop a stochastic block model. They use a network analysis, and the idea is that one uses them to probabilistically cluster nodes of a network into blocks, or in our context, cluster teams into hopefully competitively balanced blocks. And one of the key issues is to assess the uncertainty. Is to assess the uncertainty in the number of blocks and to assess the uncertainty in the allocation of teams to blocks. So which team gets allocated to which block. So we apply our model to every season from the old English First Division through to the current Premier League from 1978 through to last year. And to look ahead a wee bit, what we find is that there is some evidence that there's a structural change from a reasonably balanced league into a two-tier league. And that happened, it seems, around the early 2000s. All right, so the English First Division Premier League, so a brief history. One of the oldest football leagues in the world, dates back to 1888. It grew rapidly. The second division was introduced in 1892. And today it consists of 4 divisions and many leagues underneath that. So it's quite a hierarchical league structure. And each year from each league, a certain number of teams get promoted to the league above them, and a certain number of teams get relegated to the league below them. So there's a sort of flux in the number of teams in each league every year. So many changes over time, but maybe the biggest change in the most recent past is the introduction of the Premier League in 1992-93. And that brought in, as we know, sort of huge changes in revenue. So, for example, the first TV deal between the Premier League and the TV companies, principally Sky, generated around £40 million. And then fast forward to 2016, 2019, that's increased to 5 billion odd. So it's a huge revenue. And, we could speculate that that's led to a lack of competitiveness in the league. But that's possibly for another day. All right. So what is done in the literature? Well, there's actually a huge number of different types of indices that are used to assess how competitive a league is. And one that recurs quite a lot is this index called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index of Competitive Balance, so HHICB. And what it does is it assesses the spread of points by each team in a season. So it simply looks at the league table at the end, asks how many points each team has, and it converts the number of points SI that team I gained and converts that into PI. So divides SI by the sum of the SIs. So then the PIs are a vector that sums up to 1. And this HHICB is basically n times the sum of the PI squareds. So it's basically a measure of spread of the vector P1 up to Pn. When each team has an identical portion of points, PI equals 1 over n, and the index equals the value 1. So again, it doesn't take into account the result when each team plays each other. It just looks at the points total at the end. In a similar vein, relative entropy or sort of versions of entropy are used as well, because they want to look at the measure of order or disorder in this vector. So entropy is a sort of natural measure to think about in that context. So the index in this case is pi log pi summed up divided by log 1 over n. And in this case, relative entropy takes a maximum value of 1 in the case where the pi's are 1 over n for each team. So lower values of relative entropy suggest a more imbalanced league. So again, two very simple indices. And here's what they look like for each of the seasons that we look at. So for the HHICB, that index is increasing over time. And that's consistent with the view that the Premier League is becoming more imbalanced over time. And the relative entropy gives you the same message, basically. But here, the relative entropy, high scorers mean less imbalanced, low scores mean more imbalanced. So the same message is conveyed in both of those plots, basically. Okay, so what are the drawbacks of those and other approaches? Well, I suppose the first kind of thing you might say is that they're not so amenable to qualitative conclusions about whether a season is balanced or not. And if a season is imbalanced, you kind of would like to know really the nature of that imbalance. So which teams, if any, are stronger than the rest? And the kind of thing that we emphasize in our paper is that these approaches that they don't explicitly model the relational nature of the data arising from a league. In other words, the fact that teams play each other and the results that arise should be important to assess if a league is competitive or not. So the network model then that we're proposing yields information about the quality of the league and the relative competitiveness. Now, the methods that we propose, they're much more computationally demanding, but the argument we make is that they're richer and give us more insights into how competitive or otherwise a league is. Okay, so here's really where the project started quite a few years ago. And the picture that you see on the left-hand side, it's a way that the league results are often represented. This kind of, you could call it a match grid. So how you read this is that the rows tell you the team that played at home, and the result in the matrix basically gives you the score playing against the away team. So for example, the first entry in this table is Arsenal, who play at home against Aston Villa. The score was 3-1 to Arsenal. And then in the league, you get the corresponding fixture when the home and away team are reversed. So Aston Villa played against Arsenal, Aston Villa at home, and they lost 1-0. So basically, all of the results are represented in this table. So what we do then is we categorize those results according to whether the result is a win, a draw, or a loss. So for example, again, Arsenal played Aston Villa and won 3-1. So we record that with a green entry here in the table on the right-hand side. The reverse fixture, where Aston Villa lost to Arsenal, that's a red. So again, the convention being that the teams in the rows are at home and the teams in the columns are away from home. So it's really just a way of converting our data into categorical outcomes in a very simple way. And the idea we had was basically to use the matrix on the right-hand side, so this colored matrix, as an adjacency matrix of a complete graph, and then to use network methods to try to analyze that network, quote unquote. Okay, so our data then is basically that matrix on the left-hand side, but where the colors are now converted to ones, twos, and threes, according to whether the home team won, drew, or lost. Okay, so each entry of that matrix is basically a dyadic variable. So meaning that it's the outcome when node I plays node J, or team I plays team J, and three possible outcomes: a 1 for a home win, a 2 for a draw, or a 3 for a loss. And these are categorical variables, so the numerical values have no intrinsic meaning. All right, so what we do then is we view that results matrix as an adjacency matrix of a directed network. So as I said, each node represents a team, and we then have a weighted edge from node I to node J, which records the outcome when team I plays at home against team J, and the weighted edge takes values 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so the idea here is that the network is dense and complete. So every team plays every other team, and you can think about the edges of that network as being directed. The edge is directed from the home team to the away team. And then you have the reverse fixture where the direction goes the opposite way. And the point of making this observation is that it allows us to basically appeal to statistical models in the social network analysis literature to help us find structure in the results matrix Y. So that's pretty much where we started this project from. So what do we want to do? So we want to partition the N teams, and typically N is 20 in the context of the Premier League, into K blocks in such a way that the probability of a win, a draw, or a loss for the home team is broadly speaking similar when any two teams in the same block play against each other. And the same idea follows through where any team from one block plays at home against another from a different block. Okay, so in that case, there would be a similar but different chance of a win, draw, or loss in that situation. And the point is that the chance of any probability of any outcome depends on the blocks to which each team are assigned. And if we infer that K equals 1 has most support, then we've evidence that the league is balanced. Okay, so stochastic block models, just a little bit on that. So as I said, a K block or K block model. So K blocks are clusters. So each node, I belongs to 1 up to N, will be assigned to one of the blocks with membership or allocation variable Zi. So basically Zi is a label telling you what block team I is in. And for example, here's a wee cartoon at the bottom where we have a network with 12 nodes, and the colors tell you we have red and blue colors, so we've got 2 nodes, 2 blocks in this case, and here's an assignment of nodes to those blocks. These would be the Zi labels, according to giving you a color, in 1 or 2 in this instance. And the distribution of Y, the data, is assumed to be conditionally independent once you know these red and blue colors, or they're labeled Zi. And that reveals, in this instance here, a partitioning of the teams into 2 blocks that are quite well connected within, and not so much between, it turned out in this case. Okay, so our likelihood model, we model this with a multinomial model. So Zi tells us that team I belongs to block S, and Zj tells us that team J belongs to block T. So within that block, within that ST block, there'll be an underlying probability vector telling you whether you have a home win, a draw, or a loss for when team I plays against team J at home. And then we model that outcome as a multinomial probability. So the probability that Yij equals to omega, given that we know what block team I belongs to, what block team J belongs to, and the probability vector PST, it's just P omega ST. So for example, a situation where Spurs are team I assigned to block 1, playing at home against Crystal Palace, we're team J, who are assigned to block 3. If we assume that P13 is 0.6, 0.3, 0.1, and the data tells us that Spurs won 2-0, then we'd model the likelihood of that occurrence as just 0.6. So the chance of a home win for that team in block 1 playing a team in block 3. Okay, so all teams in block 1 playing at home against any team in block 3 would have the same underlying P13 vector associated to it. That's the assumption we're making here. So we take a Bayesian approach, and we place priors on everything in a hierarchical way. So this Z vector, which is of crucial importance to us, it's telling us again what teams are allocated to what blocks. We'll assume that they're IID following also a multinomial. So Zi conditional on theta, and K, the number of blocks, is IID multinomial 1 with some parameter vector theta that takes a vector of K values. So this means that probability that Zi equals to some block K is theta K. So this allows us to, and the IID assumption allows us to quite easily write out the joint probability of all of the Zs in the following way. And the next thing then we got to do is put a prior on the thetas themselves, which are a prior on the probability vector. And we assign a Dirichlet prior. Well, actually, a special case of the Dirichlet, a uniform simply on theta conditional on K. It's quite a simple prior. So that's the hierarchical part of Z given theta taken care of. Then we got to worry about the within and between block probability vectors telling us if we have a win, a draw, or a loss. So for example, if we pick out PKL, this is the three-dimensional probability vector telling us the probability of a win when home team in block K plays an away team in block L, and so on. So we've got to put a prior distribution on each of those entries. And we simply model those again as a Dirichlet. And the parameters of the Dirichlet will be also set to 1, in this case, leading to uniform distribution. All right, the prior for K, well, K is the number of blocks that we want to assign a prior to a priori. And what we do in this case is model the prior probability on K as a Python 1 truncated at 0. And what that does, a Python random variable with rate equal to 1, okay, truncated at 0. So what this means, if you see the equation here, it says that probability of K, conditions that K is bigger than 0, turns out to be equal to 1 over K factorial times e to the minus 1. In other words, that prior is proportional to 1 over K factorial. And that's important because the labels that you give to the blocks are labels, and they're invariant to permutations. So having the prior proportion of 1 over K accounts for that. And this is a strategy that has been used in lots of other contexts, including finite mixtures and SVMs in the past. So we adopt it here as well. Okay, so what I've described to you then is effectively a generative Bayesian model. So how would the data generate itself? Well, first of all, one generates k from its prior, which is a truncated Poisson 1. Then one generates the theta vector from the Dirichlet. And then given theta and k, one generates the zi's from the multinomial 1 comma theta. So that then allocates every team to one and only one block. And then one generates the PSTs for every S and T. This generates the probability vector for a within and between blocks. And then once those PSTs are generated for every S and T, we can then generate the data from the multinomial 1 given this PST vector. So that's how the data gets, conceptually is generated here. If there's any questions, by the way, just stop me and I'll going to raise your hand. I'll answer. Otherwise, I'll just keep going on. All right. Okay, so the Bayes model. So as I've described it then, it's factorizes in a pretty obvious kind of hierarchical way. So what are we interested in? We're interested in Z, which is the kind of primary thing we're interested in, really. It's what teams are allocated, what blocks are each team allocated to. We've also this quite large P matrix where the entries are these three-dimensional vectors, probabilities. Theta and K is the other obviously interesting thing. How many blocks do we have? So that factorizes into our multinomial likelihood, our Dirichlet prior distribution for P, our multinomial probability for Z, and our Dirichlet prior for theta. So we have a lot of Dirichlet multinomial pairs. So that gives us quite a lot of conjugacy. So it turns out that we can integrate out P and theta. And effectively, we're left with a distribution for Z and K given Y. So that's quite useful to us because we've now less things to sample over from our posterior. Okay, so how do we sample from the posterior? Well, we try out a collection of different MCMC moves. And without telling you really what those moves are in detail, I suppose just, what I can say is that the three different moves that change either the state of Z, but not K, moves that change the state of K, but not Z, and moves that change both. And it'll turn out that sampling, excuse me, the Z and K, the Z vector and K itself, basically amounts to permuting the rows and columns of that results matrix. Okay, and let's kind of look at that a little bit in a slide coming up. But also we have the issue of label switching. And I kind of touched on that a teeny bit earlier. And that's the idea that the latent allocation vector Z is not identifiable because the likelihoods are varying into permutations of the labels. So in common with models in finite mixtures, in hidden Markov models, and all sorts of other latent variable models of this type. So we use a version of the square assignment algorithm of Carpenetto and Toth, and it's also one that was developed in a paper by Nobile and Fernside for assessing the number of components in a finite mixture. And it also, that Nobile and Fernside paper is also quite interesting because it also analyzes this kind of posterior involving Z and K, but in the context of a finite mixture. Okay, so I said that the MCMC amounts to effectively permuting the rows and columns of this matrix. So let's kind of see what happens here. So here's a matrix from the 2018-2019 season. This is the entire set of results. So what the MCMC algorithm does, at each step, it decides pick a team basically, and see should it move into a new block or not, basically. So pick on Liverpool. So here's Liverpool's results. It's home games on the rows, and it's away results in the columns. And let's say we aim to propose to move it to the top block, which is the group of teams at the top of this matrix. So one would simply just move it to the first position in row and columns. And yeah, that's what you're left with now. So now Liverpool is allocated to Z equals to 1. And we've also got K equals to 2 in this case. So that's typically what the moves will do. They'll basically try to permute the rows and columns and also shift up and down this solid line, which is denoting the partition between the first and second groups. And yeah, just continues in that fashion. So after many permutations of rows and columns, this turns out to be the most likely allocation of teams to blocks, turns out. So in this instance, Manchester City, Liverpool, Chelsea, Spurs, Arsenal, Man United turned out to have, with highest probability, be allocated to this leading block. And then the remaining 14 teams, I think, are allocated to the second block. And you see some nice kind of structure emerging. And I'll touch on that in a second. Okay, so 3 different move types and the label switching, as I said already. Okay, so, excuse me, so on to some results. So we look at over 40 seasons from 78, 79 through to last year. Again, we want to see as the league become more or less competitive over time. And we're going to start with the most recent season, and we'll analyze that in detail, and it'll give us a sense, hopefully, of what the model is doing. Okay, so for last season, a 2-block model had, overwhelming support. So 97% of the probability mass was estimated a posteriori for that model. Okay, so this is what the league table looked like. So the teams are listed in order of the points that they've gained. And the second column in the table gives you the probability that each team is allocated to the top block, a posteriori, so conditioned on the data, and conditioned on this 2-block model, which again had most support. And you see some interesting things. You see that even though Arsenal got 69 points, which is quite close to Spurs and Chelsea, the posterior probability that they're allocated to the top block is quite less than 0.5. So something kind of interesting is happening here. And I'll explain to you in a second. It's because Arsenal didn't do very well against the top 4 teams. They weren't competitive with them, but they were, broadly speaking, competitive with the other 16 teams, despite having almost the same number of points as Chelsea and Spurs. Okay, so here is the data from 2020, 21, 22 on in figure A. And figure B is the maximum a posteriori allocation of teams to blocks. So the black solid line is partitioning, it turns out, the top 4 teams from the rest. So a K equals 2 block was chosen, and 4 teams were allocated to the top block, 16 to the second block. Okay, so what we're going to do is just look closely at those that partition and see, does it make sense in terms of the objective to assess competitiveness or otherwise. Okay, so what we do first of all is just focus on the block of teams in the top block. So this is the results when Chelsea, Liverpool, Man City and Spurs play against each other. Again, where the colours are the corresponding to the team who play at home. And what we see is that there are three home wins, because we've got 3 green colours, 3 away wins, and we've got 6 draws. So, small number of teams, so a very small sample, but, quite well balanced, despite those caveats. All right. When we look at the the within block results for the teams in block 2. What we see here is that we've got a similar sort of picture. We see a, broadly speaking, quite a balanced mix of colors for the 16 teams when they play against each other. So it's suggesting that there's quite a, some balance going on here. Those teams are competitive with each other. I mean, not completely, but reasonably so. Here's what happens when the top teams play at home against the weaker teams. Mostly green color, because the top teams tend to beat the weaker teams. So the partitioning sort of made sense, right? And the final situation is when the weaker teams play at home against the stronger teams. And mostly red colors, because they're not as competitive. So the partitioning seems to make some sense here, at least in terms of its interpretation. So what we could maybe do is sorry for going back and forth so quickly, but what we could do possibly is just look at Arsenal's results, because remember, they're quite close to Spurs points-wise and to Chelsea points-wise, but there's quite a disparity in terms of their chance of belonging to the top block. So, all right. So here's Arsenal's results. And if we look at, maybe you can just about see my pointer. It's very faint, little circle. But Arsenal, who play at home against the 4 teams, they lost 3 of the games, and they beat Spurs. So not really competitive with those teams. Likewise, when Arsenal play away from home against the teams, we now look at Arsenal's column, and we see where they play against the top 4 teams. And typically, in 3 out of the 4 games, the home team beat Arsenal. They beat Chelsea away from home. So suggesting that, they're not quite competitive with the teams in the top 4, right? Despite having almost the same number of points. Yeah, so we'd possibly push on then. Okay, so the results then over 40 seasons. What we've done here is use 2 different colors to show you what was the most probable block number. So the sandy color for k equals to 1, and the light blue color for k equals to 2. And you see then the numerical probabilities multiplied by 100 for the chance of belonging to any of those 1, 2, 3, or 4 clustered models. The message to really get across here is that for the first half of the study, you see quite a broadly speaking, kind of quite an even number of seasons where it's either a 1 or a 2 block model. But for some seasons where there's a 2 block model, for example, 84, 85. Okay, so there's the 1 block model at 44% probability against 56% for a 2 block. So although a 2 block model is preferred, there's really nothing to choose between them. And similarly for 1990-91, same kind of thing is happening. So some seasons where there's roughly equal chance of both the 1 or 2 block model happening. 80-81, 66 against 33%. But when we look at the second half of the season, the results change fairly dramatically, and you see that for almost all seasons, there's a really high probability of a 2 block model being preferred. I mean, there are some exceptional seasons. 2015, 2016 is outlying in some sense, and that was the season where Leicester won the league against all the odds. So it's coming out here quite strongly. Another interesting season was 2020, 2021. So that was the COVID season. Lots of games played behind closed doors. And, we see it outline in the sense that there is some support for a k equals 1 model, which differs from the previous seasons that came before it, with the exception of the Leicester season and so on. Okay, we can use the model then to give more insights. For example, we could ask ourselves, what's the marginal posterior allocation of teams to the strongest block? So, should each team, and this is where we effectively integrate over the uncertainty in K. And this then allows us to answer questions like, what is the most likely number of teams in the strongest block, integrating over uncertainty in K? And that's presented in this picture here, so this figure here. So it's conveying, roughly speaking, the same kind of information as the previous table with the posterior probabilities of a K equals 1 and 2 block model over time. But here we show the most likely size of the top block. Okay, so again, for the first half of the study, and sorry, again, the sand and blue color tell us the most likely number of blocks. So what we see is that there's quite high numbers for the size of the top block for the first half of the study. But for the second half of the study, typically quite low numbers. So there seems to be quite a separation in terms of how many teams are allocated to the strongest block for the second half of the study. And again, this Leicester season is one that stands out. 10-11 is the season where Man United won the league. And it seems a one-block model fits best. 2021, here's the COVID season. Games were played behind closed doors. A lot of injuries, because a lot of injuries, I suppose, COVID injuries, if you want to call them that. A lot of players had to weren't playing because of COVID, and just the results were all over the place, basically. And so we see 15 teams in the strongest block that season. But then last season, it reverts to normal again in some sense, where we got 4 teams, as we just seen a few moments ago.
Niall, can I ask a question? Is it okay for me to ask a question before we move on?
Please do, yeah.
Apologies. It's Alan Owen speaking. I'll put my video on so you can see who's speaking. Just interested about that COVID one. You've got 15 teams in the top block there. Yep. One of the things that managers of the weaker teams complained about with COVID is that they suffered from the lack of home advantage more so than the stronger teams. So is it that the 15 teams that are in that top block are basically the top 15 teams, and the other 5 teams are those at the bottom of the league? And could it be that it's the lack of a home advantage, the fact that they relied on home advantage more so than the strong teams?
I think, yes, that's. I think we may have made that point in our paper, actually.
Oh, sorry.
No, I'm not totally sure on that point, actually. But I think it's a good hypothesis to suggest that maybe home advantage was an issue, because as you're right, you're right to highlight that games were played behind closed doors.
Yeah, and those bottom teams often rely on home support to eke out the odd draw against a strong team, don't they?
And I suppose, kind of conversely, when the so-called weaker teams played against the bigger teams in an empty stadium, in Old Trafford empty, Stamford Bridge empty, and so on, it may have given those weaker teams a slight advantage in that the home effect might have been less. We should probably go back and interrogate the results to see exactly, is the home effect less that season than for other seasons. That's a really good point. So
I can certainly let you know that the home advantage pretty much was way lower that year.
Okay.
Not surprising. I mean,
yes,
I've personally done some analysis on home advantage, and that year fell down. So
good. Super. So it's consistent. Let's investigate that.
Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot for that comment, Alan. It was wonderful. Alrighty. So just to sort of summarize some of the results here. Okay, so most support each season for either a 1 or a 2 block model, but the number of seasons where a 2 block model has most support, that seems to change quite a lot in the 2000s and onwards. So in particular, over the first half of the study, kind of broadly equal support for a K equals 1 or K equals 2 model. But since 2000, 2001, 2002, and so on, there's typically most support for a 2 block model. And so the posterior probability of 2 block model is over 0.85 for almost every season. since 2003, 2004, with the exception of the Leicester season and so on. So it's given us evidence that the league is becoming more competitively imbalanced. And also the size of the strongest block has been quite small, pretty much, apart from the COVID season, the Leicester season, and so on. Okay, and we thought then to look back at those indices, the Hirschman index and the relative entropy index, and basically to superimpose on those index values each season the probability of a one block model. And again, you sort of see some nice kind of patterns happening. So for the earlier seasons, they have lower index values for the HICB. And for the more recent seasons, higher values, but also more probability of, less probability of a one block model. And the same thing for relative entropy. So in some sense, it's sort of validation of the SBM approach. Okay, so just a final little analysis on this kind of issue of, is there a big six group of teams? Because we see it all the time in the media. It's just kind of taken as given that there are a big six group of teams. So the modeling approach lets us really sort of investigate that. So what we've done here is looked just at the past 20 seasons, and we've asked which teams are in that strongest block. And in particular, we pick out Arsenal, Chelsea, Liverpool, Man City, Man United, and Spurs. And for some seasons, there are other teams that belong to those top blocks over time, and they're indicated here. But what you see is that Arsenal have been in the top block of teams 17 out of those 20 seasons. Chelsea, 19 out of 20 seasons. Liverpool, 15 out of 20 seasons. Man City, they emerged around 2010, 2011 when the Abu Dhabi group took them over, right? That's when money rolled into Man City, and since then they've always been in the top block. Man United, consistently in the top block, with some hiccups in the last couple of seasons. So 17 out of 20 times. And Spurs, kind of like Man City, were not regular members of the top six until 2010, 2011, when they have consistently been there, apart from this season, 2019, 2020. So the Big Six does seem to be a phenomenon. And actually, one might say a Big Four from 2000 to 2010, and then a Big Six with the inclusion of Man City and Spurs. So it is grounded in reality, it seems. All right, so just to finish up then, so again, just to repeat what I've said already, our analysis shows that there's some evidence that the league was quite balanced from 1980s to the 2000s. However, since then, strong evidence that the league has become more imbalanced. And we see the emergence of seasons where two blocks are most probable, or two clusters. And we've seen that the emergence of a so-called Big Six around 2010. Okay, pardon me. So, there's a bunch of extensions that one could look at. I think the most obvious one is that the model is clearly sort of summarizing the results from the season, because we're not modeling the number of goals scored. And obviously there's a huge literature on doing that, actually modeling goals scored by each team, going back to Dixon and Coles, where they use this Poisson GLM framework. And there's been a bunch of other extensions of that model since. So it's quite an active area still. One could extend to other sports, so where the outcome is either a win or a loss. So, tennis and so on. Covariates, so rankings, form, whatever, there could be a bunch of things one could include. Also, trying to incorporate dependence in the SBM over time. And the other thing that we haven't looked at, but I'm looking at with a student at the moment, is stochastic ordering of the blocks. So there's a natural order, because if a team in block 1 plays a team in block 3, they should be more likely to beat that team than if a team in block 1 plays a team in block 2. But we don't use that information. we assume that the labels of the blocks 1, 2, or 3 in this case are, they have no meaning. But so stochastic ordering might make sense here. And that's it. So it's the final whistle. So so here's an archive link to the paper. It's actually quite an old link because we have been revising the paper since. So actually, a lot of the results you see in the presentation here isn't in the paper, but we're going to update it on archive, and hopefully the paper will be accepted soon. It's gone through a couple of revisions. So, so that was just extra slides if we need them. So that's the talk finished basically. So I'm happy to take some questions if you have any.
Yeah, could we all thank Niall for a very interesting talk in the kind of usual Zoom way, or with your actual hands on screen if you want to. It's a very good talk. Thanks.
Thanks, Pete.
Does anyone have any questions? And I'll try and keep an eye out for hands. So I have a question in the meantime. So you mentioned the computational cost in passing was high. And could you give us a kind of a flavor for how long it kind of would take to run this sort of model?
Yeah, actually not. Yeah, it's more computationally demanding than any of the simple indices, which you kind of do in a flash. The SVM stuff, it doesn't take an awful lot of time actually. I think maybe, I don't know, like maybe half an hour, 20 minutes per season, basically. So quite kind of feasible. But maybe for applications where you have many more nodes, if you think about other extensions to other sports, maybe, or other kind of context, then it's going to scale. It's going to you're going to reach kind of a limit where the computation gets out of hand quickly. So with SVMs, if you use full MCMC, a few hundred nodes, and it gets a bit complicated.
Okay.
So in that case, people use things like EM and so on to get over that.
And I had a follow-up question was, did you think about applying it to any of the leagues or any of the sport? I know you mentioned it in the end there. I guess
yeah,
a lot of leagues have got some obvious dominance. I guess I was thinking of other sports where there might be, in the US, whether the draft system, does that inherently make sports more balanced and are less prone to this sort of phenomenon?
Yeah, that's actually a very good point, because a lot of the literature on competitive balance will use the draft system as a sort of example of how to avoid a dominance of groups of teams. Other extensions that I would like to, just out of curiosity myself, is to see how the model progresses throughout a season. Because at the moment, we just analyze the data at the end of season when the network is complete, where everyone has played everyone twice. But it would be interesting to see how the model progresses, after a certain number of games have been played, and to see how it changes over the course of the season. And it's totally straightforward to do that, really. So I think Alan has a question.
He does, yes.
Is that okay if I come in? Just I was interested on that, whether the championship in the second tier in the UK would be a single block sort of outcome because of the kind of higher levels of competitiveness, and similarly with Leagues 1 and League 2 as well in the UK. Scotland, I would expect to be two blocks. Be interesting to see how often any other teams manage to squeeze into that one. But one of the questions I've got was, I'm not totally sure I fully understood all the workings of the model, but if I can, so apologies if this question's a bit naive, but when it runs, does it effectively sort out block 1, and then when it's looking at the remaining blocks, does it ignore block 1 and have a look to see if it can subdivide block 2 into 2 sub blocks, or would you need to run the model so that you get a 2-block outcome and then ditch the block 1 data, the results for block 1, and just run the model on block 2 only to see if there's 2 sub blocks?
No, it basically tries to do everything in a sort of joint manner. So,
Right.
like you can kind of think of it that at the end of each, so it's an MCMC based thing. So at the end of each iteration, you have this Z vector, and the Z vector could have all ones, meaning that it's just a single block that's been considered at that time, or it could be a mixture of ones and twos, or a mixture of ones, twos, and threes, whereby you'd have a 3-block model and so on. So it's the algorithm allows you to change the number of blocks and the allocation of teams on the fly, basically. And then at the end, you have to sort of post-process and see how many times the model visited a 1-block model, a 2-block model, a 3-block model, and then search within, let's say, a 2-block model to see what was the allocation of teams to both blocks. You know, if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah, I just wondered if it makes a difference because I presume that's including that when it does that, it's including the performance of block 2 teams against block 1 teams, isn't it?
Yeah.
So then teams that are in block 2, you've got this single block of block 2 teams. And part of the reason why they're all together or deemed to be together versus a 3-block model is because account has been taken of their performance against block 1 teams. I just wondered if you excluded the data from, you fit the model to a season and you come up with a block 2 model, if you can then exclude the block 1 data and rerun the algorithm on only block 2 to see if you to see if that comes back with a 1-block model.
I see what you mean. No, we didn't try anything like that actually, but that's
what my motivation for that.
Yeah.
What I'm wondering is whether they're relegated. So, if is it that really the teams that get relegated is it just as a result of some serious bad luck, apart from slightly weaker performances? Or is it really because there is two blocks within block 2? One of which includes the relegated teams plus those fighting.
I don't know is the answer to that, but no, I see what you're getting at actually, and I think would be going back to what I sort of said a while back about understanding how the model progresses over time might be interesting to see, and to take a closer look at the teams in the relegated position and see, is there some sort of pattern to how they've possibly got off to
in the English Premier League, there's often a saying, isn't it? The team that's bottom at Christmas will get relegated, and it's been fairly consistent. And I just wondered, could that be refuted or verified by your approach?
Yes. Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, it's true. And there's a consistency in the number of points that saves a team from relegation each season, right?
It's bad news for Wolverhampton Wanderers fans because they're currently bottom, and they won't play again until Christmas. But it's a bit unusual this year, isn't it? It's much that they've got a lot more games to get themselves out of trouble. But
it'll be interesting to see the effect of the big break, actually, how that will affect teams in terms of the momentum. But very good points. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So there's a question in the chat from Raj that I'm happy to run through. So he says, thanks for the talk. You showed an example season with Arsenal, but generally the probability of being in the top group was closely related to league position. Basically, are there any counterexamples where this probability deviates from league position or number of points? And as a follow-up, he also wanted to ask why you thought the probabilities for clusters more than 2 was basically pretty low across the seasons.
Okay, let me just have a read of that again. Actually, that's a very good question. The idea that, if I get it correct, that there may be are there situations where a team gets more points than another team, but it's in a lower block than the team that has less points than it. I don't know is the answer. I'd imagine that's a a rare event if it happens, but I'm going to follow up and have a wee look through and see why probabilities for clusters more than 3, so 3, 4, and 5 remain pretty low. I mean, I suppose it's because you've got 20 teams in a league, and to have a 3 or 4 block model, you're really talking about clusters with just a couple of teams in them, and maybe the model can't handle such a small number of blocks, a small number of teams in a block. I'm not sure, but it's a good point. And I'm not sure if that adequately answers your question, Raj, but thanks for your question.
It could be related to the length of the season, right? I guess in baseball, you might be able to tease these things out a bit more when you've got a really, really long season. 38 games isn't particularly long, is it? Sure,
that's true as well, actually. Yeah, but yeah, I suppose on the other hand, you still have quite a lot of data, really, because you've 380 games actually over the course of the season. So it's so these are really good questions and kind of things to think about.
Has anyone got any other questions? Oh, yes, we have a question. Peter?
Hi, yeah, that was an interesting talk. I'm sorry I only joined it halfway through. Talking about applications to other sports. So the thing about football is that every team plays every other team, both home and away. Whereas in other sports, you mentioned baseball, but of course, not every team, the teams don't always play each other in any given season. So how important, is the fact that you've basically got a balanced design here? How important is that to your methodology?
I think it's useful that we have that balanced design effectively. Allows us to kind of give nice insights and so on, and the fact that it is balanced is useful, I think, statistically to try to discern a signal, but it's not inherently important to the model, actually, because in other contexts you can imagine in SVM modeling generally, networks are usually very sparse, in the sense that two nodes will be unlikely to connect to each other in something like a friendship network. Take two people around them, they're probably not going to be friends. So the number of edges will be quite small generally. So SVMs could certainly be applied to situations where you don't have this kind of complete balance. So things like tennis, maybe, for example, you have another sort of phenomena that the stronger teams tend to play against each other more than the weaker teams, because they tend to progress further in competitions. So they'll endure more, they last more. So in that situation, you'll have it certainly wouldn't be balanced. And I think maybe Alan made a point that in Scotland you don't have that balanced design because teams split up halfway through. So teams played three times twice against every team and once against top teams after the league splits in two. So it's a waffly answer, but
yeah, thanks.
No worries, thank you.
Okay, and in that case, I'd just like to thank Niall again for coming to give a talk. Much appreciated, very interesting, very insightful, and yeah, really appreciate you chatting to us today.
No worries. Thanks a lot, Pete, for organising. It's been a real pleasure.
No problem.
And really great questions. Thanks, everybody.